Imagine a storm that no one saw coming, an operation so enormous that it sent shockwaves across Asia. Picture thousands of Japanese soldiers marching across muddy Chinese fields, columns of tanks rattling down shattered highways, skies roaring with aircraft, and entire cities trembling under the weight of a plan meant to redraw the map of the war. This wasn't just another military campaign. It was the biggest ground offensive Japan launched in the entire Second World War. This was Operation Ichi-Go. Hello, welcome back to the channel. Today, we take you deep inside one of the most ambitious, brutal, and often overlooked operations of World War II, a campaign that changed the balance of power in East Asia, exposed the weaknesses of the Chinese nationalist forces, and set the stage for political transformations whose effects still echo through modern history. Sit back, because what you're about to hear is not just a retelling. It's a journey into the heart of a desperate Japanese empire, a struggling Chinese nation, and the strategic crossroads that shaped the future. The story begins in 1944. Japan was bleeding. On the Pacific Islands, American forces clawed closer to the Japanese mainland. In the skies, long-range American B-29 bombers flying from new bases in southern China began to strike the Japanese home islands. To Tokyo, this was intolerable. Japan had fought for years to dominate East Asia, and now bombing raids launched from Chinese airfields threatened its vision of invincibility. Something had to be done. Inside dimly lit Japanese headquarters, maps stretched across tables. The goal was simple but colossal. Japan needed to launch a ground offensive from its positions in northern China all the way down to southern China, linking territories, destroying American bomber bases, crippling the nationalist Chinese forces, and securing a land route from Manchuria to Indochina. The scale was staggering: more than 500,000 Japanese troops, thousands of vehicles, columns of artillery, and sweeping support from the Imperial Japanese Air Force. The operation was named Ichi-Go Operation No. 1, but behind the cold strategic calculations lay the harsh reality of war. China had been fighting Japan since 1937. Entire cities lay in ruins. Tens of millions had been displaced. The nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek struggled to hold the country together, while the communist forces grew steadily in the shadows. Operation Ichi-Go would strike at this fragile balance, and the Japanese hoped it would shatter Chinese resistance completely. The offensive began in April 1944 in north-central China. It opened like a thunderclap. On the ground, Japanese infantry units surged forward, pushing through Chinese defensive lines. Many Chinese troops were brave but poorly equipped, their rifles aging, their ammunition limited, and their air support almost non-existent. When Japanese tanks rolled across their trenches, many had no anti-tank weapons to stop them. Entire positions collapsed in hours. The city of Luoyang was among the first major targets. Its fall would open the path toward central China. Chinese forces attempted to defend it, but coordination was weak, and the Japanese advance overwhelmed them. After fierce street battles, the city fell. The victory emboldened the Japanese high command, convincing them that their grand operation might truly succeed. But the deeper the Japanese pushed into China, the more resistance stiffened. Chinese soldiers fought hard despite dire conditions. Villagers fled burning homes, creating columns of refugees stretching across the countryside. The Japanese advance was unstoppable, yet it came at immense human cost. Part of the plan involved seizing a vital railway line of the Beijing-Hankou Railway. This railway was the spine of northern China, and controlling it meant controlling the flow of troops and supplies. Japanese engineers moved swiftly behind the front lines, repairing and restarting sections of the line. It was one of the logistical miracles of the operation, allowing Japan to pour men and materials deeper into Chinese territory. Yet even as they advanced, Japan faced a silent enemy: its own overstretched empire. Supplies thinned, tropical diseases ravaged troops. Fuel shortages strained tanks and trucks. But the machine kept moving forward toward its ultimate targets: Changsha, Hengyang, and eventually the American air bases near Guilin and Luzhou. By mid-1944, the world watched China with uncertainty. American military advisors worried that if China collapsed, Japan could divert massive forces back to the Pacific. The Chinese nationalists, exhausted after years of war, struggled to hold the line. Operation Ichi-Go was more than a military campaign. It became a test of China's survival, and as the Japanese army advanced deeper, the battles that followed would become some of the fiercest and most desperate clashes fought on Chinese soil. The second phase of Operation Ichi-Go Ichi-Go shifted the fighting into the heart of central China, where Japanese commanders hoped to deliver a crushing blow to the nationalist forces. Their next major objective was Changsha, a city famous for repelling multiple Japanese offensives earlier in the war. Changsha was a symbol, one of China's proudest defensive victories. But in 1944, the defenders stood in a far more fragile position. Supply shortages plagued the Chinese. Units were under strength. Morale was weakening. The nationalist government suffered from political infighting, corruption, and strained alliances. Still, the defenders of Changsha prepared to resist. As the Japanese army advanced, their sheer firepower began to break Chinese defensive lines. Artillery barrages thundered through the city's outskirts. Bombers swooped overhead, dropping explosives on military positions and civilian neighborhoods alike. Flames engulfed buildings as families scrambled to escape. Street by street, Japanese troops fought their way forward, and after a brutal struggle, Changsha fell. Its fall sent shockwaves across China. It felt as though the heart of resistance had been pierced. But the Japanese didn't stop. Their forces continued pushing south toward Hengyang, one of the toughest strongholds in the entire campaign. Hengyang's defense would become one of the most heroic and tragic episodes of Operation Ichi-Go. The Chinese 10th Army at Hengyang was heavily outnumbered, but determined to hold at any cost. Their commander Fang Xianju rallied his troops, declaring that they would defend the city to the last. When the Japanese surrounded Hengyang, the siege began. Waves of attacks crashed against the defensive lines. Japanese artillery flattened bunkers, machine gun nests, and trenches. House-to-house combat raged day and night. Yet the 10th Army refused to break. For more than 6 weeks, they held out against overwhelming odds. Ammunition ran low. Food supplies dwindled. Wounded soldiers lay untreated as Japanese forces tightened their grip. Eventually, after more than 40 days of relentless siege, Fang Xianju's remaining forces were on the brink of annihilation. He surrendered, not out of weakness, but because his men had no strength left to fight. Even the Japanese commanders, impressed by the defenders' courage, treated Fang with respect and negotiated humane conditions for his troops. The defense of Hengyang bought China a crucial time and became a symbol of resistance that lifted national morale during one of its darkest moments. But while heroism shone on the front lines, political problems deepened behind them. The nationalist government struggled to maintain unity. American advisors criticized Chinese leadership for poor planning and misuse of resources. Meanwhile, communist forces in northern China continued expanding their influence, preparing for the power struggle that would erupt after the war. As Operation Ichi-Go surged forward, Japanese forces finally reached their strategic objectives, the American air bases in Guangxi province. These bases were home to the B-29 superfortresses that had been bombing Japan. Destroying them would shield the Japanese homeland from further long-range attacks, at least temporarily. The battles for Guilin and Luzhou were intense. Many Chinese troops were inexperienced recruits, quickly assembled to defend the cities. When the Japanese arrived, their superior firepower overwhelmed resistance. The fall of these bases forced the Americans to relocate their bombing operations to the Mariana Islands, a major strategic shift that changed the trajectory of the air war in the Pacific. By late 1944, the Japanese Empire seemed to be celebrating the success of its massive operation. They had seized huge territories, eliminated China-based American bombers, linked Japanese, held regions from north to south, and weakened the nationalist armies. On the surface, Operation Ichi-Go appeared to be a stunning victory. But beneath this apparent triumph lay an uncomfortable truth. Japan had won land, not victory. Its gains dragged the empire deeper into a quagmire. Supply lines stretched dangerously thin. Occupying vast regions required manpower Japan could no longer spare. Guerrilla attacks by Chinese resistance fighters increased. Meanwhile, the United States continued to push across the Pacific, capturing the Mariana Islands and preparing for even larger assaults. Operation Ichi-Go had expanded Japan's front lines at the very moment it lacked the resources to maintain them. And worse still, the operation had unintended consequences that reshaped China's internal future. Consequences that neither Tokyo nor Chongqing fully understood at the time. By the final stage of Operation Ichi-Go, Japan had achieved its territorial goals, but something subtle and dangerous was unfolding across China. Something that would transform the political landscape of Asia. As Japanese forces shifted south and central Chinese territories fell, the nationalist government's control weakened dramatically. Entire regions were cut off. Refugees flooded safer zones, straining already limited resources. Corruption within the nationalist administration worsened as panic spread. The economic situation deteriorated so severely that inflation skyrocketed, and morale collapsed among civilian populations who once believed victory was possible. Yet in the shadows of this chaos, another power quietly strengthened: the Chinese Communist forces under Mao Zedong. While the nationalists lost territory to Japan, the communists expanded their influence in northern China. They organized local militias, redistributed land, won civilian support, and conducted guerrilla warfare against Japanese units. Every Japanese victory over the nationalists became, paradoxically, a political victory for the communists. Operation Ichi-Go unintentionally accelerated the rise of the communist movement that would later win the Chinese Civil War. Meanwhile, Japan's massive offensive achieved little to change the overall war. Even after seizing the American air bases, Japan could not stop U.S. bombing raids launched from the newly captured Mariana Islands. In fact, by 1945, American bombers were hitting Japan harder than ever before. Inside Japan, High Command realized the grim truth: Ichi-Go had consumed enormous resources, but the empire was still losing the war. In the Chinese countryside, Japanese soldiers found themselves occupying vast territories with dwindling supplies. Guerrilla attacks cut supply routes, ambushed convoys, and sabotaged infrastructure. Entire battalions were tied down simply trying to hold what had been captured. The operation had become a burden rather than a strategic advantage. Chinese civilians suffered immensely. Villages were destroyed. Farmlands were trampled by armies. Food shortages intensified. Disease spread quickly in war-torn regions. Though Japanese officers hoped that Ichi-Go would eliminate Chinese resistance, it instead deepened local hatred and pushed more civilians toward anti-Japanese movements. In 1945, as Japan's empire began collapsing under American pressure in the Pacific, the massive gains of Operation Ichi-Go became impossible to defend. When Japan surrendered in August 1945 after the atomic bombings and Soviet invasion of Manchuria, the territories seized during the operation rapidly returned to Chinese control. But the story of Operation Ichi-Go didn't end on the battlefield. It continued long after the war. The nationalist forces emerged battered and weakened, having lost much of their military strength during the Japanese invasion. When the Chinese Civil War reignited, the communists, empowered by their wartime expansion, swept across China with speed and momentum. By 1949, the People's Republic of China was established, and Chiang Kai-shek's government retreated to Taiwan. In the grand scope of history, Ichi-Go was a turning point. Not just a military operation, but a catalyst that altered China's political destiny. From a military perspective, Operation Ichi-Go demonstrated the scale of Japan's desperation in the final years of the war. It was a campaign fueled by ambition but doomed by strategic overreach. Japan temporarily linked its occupied territories, destroyed American bomber bases, and captured critical Chinese cities. But these gains came at a cost the empire could not afford. China, though devastated, endured. The resistance of soldiers at Hengyang, the sacrifices of civilians, and the resilience of millions under impossible conditions ensured that Japan's victory would never be complete. Today, Operation Ichi-Go stands as one of the most dramatic yet least discussed operations of World War II. A campaign that reshaped East Asia and foreshadowed the political shifts that continue to shape the region. And as we revisit these events, we remember the countless lives affected by the largest Japanese land offensive of the war. This was not just a battle for territory. It was a struggle for survival, identity, and the future of a nation caught between empire war and revolution. Thank you for watching and for joining this deep dive into one of history's most significant but overlooked operations. If you enjoyed this story and want more untold chapters of World War II, stay connected, and we'll bring you more forgotten histories from the past that still matter today.